vote or wishing to change their vote? If not, the ayes are 53, the nays are 38. The motion is agreed to.
Mr. President, I sent a cloture.
The clerk will report the nomination.
Nomination, Department of Homeland Security, Alejandro Nicholas Mayorkas of the District of Columbia to be Deputy Secretary.
The Majority Leader.
I'm sorry I couldn't hear you.
Senate will be in order.
I would ask the clerk to report a cloture motion under the direction of the chair.
The clerk will report.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the nomination of Alejandro Nicholas Mayorkas of the District of Columbia to be Deputy Secretary of Homeland Security, signed by 18 senators as follows.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that reading the names be waived.
Is there objection? Without objection.
I move to proceed to legislative session. Next.
Is there a second?
It's the next one.
Mr. President, I got ahead of myself. I asked,
next one?
we move to legislative session.
Mr. President.
The Republican Leader. Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered.
I now move, Mr. President, to proceed to executive session to consider count number 459.
The question is on the motion to proceed.
I ask for the ayes and ayes.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be.
Okay.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Ms. Ayotte. Ms. Baldwin. Aye. This is a motion to proceed to executive session. Motion to proceed to. Mr. Barrasso. Cruz, Scott. Yep. Collins. Tester. Cantwell. You and Jay Buck. McCaskey. Fisher.
Shelby, no.
Ayotte. Baggage. Isaacson. Aye. Roberts. Harana. Mr. Baucus.
Senator Cardin, call recording. Aye.
In the affirmative.
Looks like we're working together.
Gotcha. Yeah. Aye.
Which of you guys?
Mr. Bennett. Mr. Reed. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Donnelly, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. Heller, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kane, Mr. King, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Landrieu. Yep. Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Manchin. Yeah, you're good. Mr. Manchin?
Did you need it?
Yeah, he voted. I think he voted aye. Mr. Manchin?
Do you want me to
Yes.
come something? Yeah.
Yeah, gotcha. Okay. Durbin? Oh, yeah. I got it. Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, I got you. Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Baucus, Begich, Bennett, Blumenthal, Booker, Boxer, Brown, Cantwell, Cardin, Harper, Casey, Collins, Coons, Donnelly, Durbin, Feinstein, Franken, Gillibrand, Hagan, Harkin, Hatch, Heinrich, Heitkamp, Hirono, Johnson of South Dakota, Kane, King, Klobuchar, Landrieu, Manchin, Klobuchar, Leahy, Manchin, Markey, McCaskill, Menendez, Merkley, Mikulski, Murphy, Murray, Nelson, Reed of Rhode Island, Reed of Nevada, Sanders, Schatz, Schumer, Stabenow, Tester, Udall of Colorado, Warner, Warren, Whitehouse, and Wyden. Mr. Corker. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Sessions. Mr. Udall of New Mexico, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Alexander, Ayotte, Barrasso, Bozeman, Burr, Chambliss, Coates, Coburn, Cochran, Corker, Cornyn, Crapo, Cruz, Enzi, Fisher, Flake, Grassley, Heller, Hoven, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johans, Johnson of Wisconsin, Lee, McConnell, Moran, Murkowski, Risch, Roberts, Rubio, Scott, Sessions, Shelby, Thune, Toomey, and Wicker. Mr. Pryor, aye. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Mr. Portman. Mr. Portman, no. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rockefeller, aye.
Senators wishing to vote or wishing to change their vote? If not, the ayes are 55, the nays are 37. The motion is agreed to. The clerk will report the nomination.
Nomination, Department of the Treasury, John Andrew Koskinen of the District of Columbia to be the Commissioner of the Internal Revenue.
Mr. President, I send a cloture motion to the desk.
The clerk will report the motion.
Cloture motion, we, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the nomination of John Andrew Koskinen of the District of Columbia to be Commissioner of the Internal Revenue, signed by 19 senators as follows.
I ask unanimous consent that reading the names be waived.
Without objection.
I move to proceed to legislative session.
The question is on the motion. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it.
Mr. President,
The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to.
I move now to executive session to consider counter number 382.
Question is on the motion. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to.
Senate cloture motion.
The clerk will report the nomination.
I apologize for jumping ahead, Mr. President.
Nomination, the judiciary, Brian J. Davis of Florida to be United States District Judge for the Middle District of Florida.
I now ask the clerk to report, under your direction, a cloture motion.
The clerk will report.
Cloture motion, we the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the nomination of Brian J. Davis of Florida to be United States District Judge for the Middle District of Florida, signed by 19 senators as follows.
I ask consent that reading the names not be necessary.
Without objection.
I now move to proceed to legislative session.
The question is on the motion. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to.
Mr. President, I move to proceed to executive session and consider calendar number 452.
The question is on the motion. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. Ayes appear to have it. Ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to. The clerk will report the nomination.
Nomination, Federal Reserve System, Janet L. Yellen of California to be Chairman of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System.
I have a cloture motion at the desk.
The clerk will report.
Cloture motion, we the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the nomination of Janet L. Yellen of California to be Chairman of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System, signed by 17 senators as follows.
Mr. President, I ask reading the names be waived.
Without objection.
I now move to proceed to legislative session.
The question is on the motion. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to.
I now move to proceed to executive session to consider calendar number 455.
The question is on the motion. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to. The clerk will report the nomination.
Nomination, Department of Veterans Affairs, Sloan D. Gibson of the District of Columbia to be Deputy Secretary.
There's a cloture motion at the desk, Mr. President.
The clerk will report.
Cloture motion, we the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the nomination of Sloan D. Gibson of the District of Columbia to be Deputy Secretary of Veterans Affairs, signed by 17 senators as follows.
I ask reading the names be waived, Mr. President.
Without objection.
I now move to proceed to legislative session.
The question is on the motion. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to.
I now move to proceed to executive session to consider calendar number 445.
The question is on the motion. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to. The clerk will report the nomination.
Nomination, Department of State, Sarah Sewell of Massachusetts to be an Undersecretary of State.
I ask the cloture motion at the desk be reported.
Clerk will report.
Cloture motion, we the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the nomination of Sarah Sewell of Massachusetts to be an Undersecretary of State, Civilian Security, Democracy, and Human Rights, signed by 17 senators as follows.
I ask unanimous consent that reading the names be waived.
Without objection.
I now move to proceed to legislative session.
The question is on the motion. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to.
I now move to proceed to executive session to consider calendar number 371.
The question is on the motion. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to. The clerk will report the nomination.
Nomination, Department of the Interior, Michael L. Connor of New Mexico to be Deputy Secretary.
Mr. President, I send a cloture motion to the desk.
The clerk will report the motion.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the nomination of Michael L. Connor of New Mexico to be Deputy Secretary of the Interior, signed by 18 senators as follows.
I ask unanimous consent the reading of names be waived.
Without objection.
I move to proceed to legislative session.
The question is on the motion. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to.
I now move to proceed to calendar number 457. I ask that it be in an executive session.
The question is on the motion. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to. The clerk will report the nomination.
Nomination, Department of the Treasury, Sarah Bloom Raskin of Maryland to be Deputy Secretary.
I send a cloture motion to the desk.
The clerk will report the motion.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the nomination of Sarah Bloom Raskin of Maryland to be Deputy Secretary of Treasury, signed by 18 senators as follows.
I ask unanimous consent the reading of the names be waived.
Without objection.
I move to proceed to legislative session.
The question is on the motion. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to.
I now move to proceed to executive session to consider calendar number 356.
The question is on the motion. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to. The clerk will report the nomination.
Nomination, Department of Defense, Jessica Garofalo Wright of Pennsylvania to be Undersecretary of Defense for Personnel and Readiness.
Mr. President, I send a cloture motion to the desk.
The clerk will report the motion.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the nomination of Jessica Garofalo Wright of Pennsylvania to be Undersecretary of Defense for Personnel and Readiness, signed by 17 senators as follows.
I ask unanimous consent the reading of the names not be necessary.
Without objection.
I now move to proceed to legislative session.
Question is on the motion. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to.
I now move to proceed to executive session to consider calendar number 189.
The question is on the motion. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to. The clerk will report the nomination.
Nomination, Chemical Safety and Hazard Investigation Board, Richard J. Engler of New Jersey to be a member of the Chemical Safety and Hazard Investigation Board.
I send a cloture motion to the desk.
The clerk will report the motion.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the nomination of Richard J. Engler of New Jersey to be a member of the Chemical Safety and Hazard Investigation Board, signed by 17 senators as follows.
I ask unanimous consent that the reading of the names be waived.
Without objection.
I now move to proceed to legislative session.
The question is on the motion. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to.
Mr. President, I now ask unanimous consent that we proceed to morning business. Senators allowed to speak for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection.
Would you, with the exception of Sessions, be allowed to speak for 30 minutes?
Yes, Mr. President, it's my understanding that Senator Sessions tonight wants to speak for up to 30 minutes, so that would be everybody be limited to 10 minutes except him.
Without objection.
Note the absent quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Ms. Abbott.
President.
The senator from Alabama.
Mr. President, the Senate in quorum call.
It is.
I would ask consent that the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I'd spoken a bit earlier in relation to the nomination of Jeh Johnson to be the Secretary of Health and Homeland Security, and it's an important department, 240,000 people, including disparate agencies such as the Coast Guard, the Secret Service, the TSA airport personnel, and ICE officers who enforce immigration laws, our Border Patrol officers who patrol the border, the Customs and Immigration Service, which evaluate and approve or disapprove people who apply for admission to the United States, and agency after agency. Many of these are complex departments. I've watched it, and I do not believe it has been brought together to the degree it ought to be. And it hasn't had the kind of strong leadership it needs to have to be an effective producer for the American people. In addition to that, we've got the difficulty that this administration has basically told the immigration component of Homeland Security, one of its largest component parts, that they shouldn't do their job. They've been blocked and instructed not to enforce law to a degree that Professor Turley said it represents a unacceptable alteration of the Madisonian understanding of separation of powers. In other words, the President is charged with the duty to enforce law, to see that the laws of the United States are faithfully enforced. He's not given the power to flatly direct his officers not to enforce laws of the United States Congress. And so Mr. Johnson, I'm sure, has many abilities. He's apparently a Wall Street lawyer, big political campaigner, raised a bunch of money, gave money to President Obama, is a close confidant of President Obama, was made the one of the legal counsel for the Department of Defense, which he said he was President Obama's man at the Department of Defense. But he's not had any kind of real leadership, and I would expect leadership and management experience. He shows no interest in or desire to seize control of this department and try to make it better and to honor the officers who are a part of it and who serve their country often at risk every day, only to find that high political appointees in that department undermine their ability to enforce the law and place their lives at risk. You say, Jeff, that's an exaggeration. I'm going to talk tonight in some detail about just a list of some of the things that this administration has done to undermine, block, and frustrate the ability of the fine law officers, ICE officers, Customs and Enforcement officers, Border Patrol, who serve our country on a daily basis at risk to themselves. And it's not good. A lot of people might not know. I was a federal prosecutor and attorney general of Alabama, and when I was traveling the state, I'd meet with law enforcement officers, and I would ask them, this was back in the 90s, the mid-90s. What happens when you apprehend somebody in Alabama that you identify as illegally in the country? And their answer was nothing. We let them go. That we're told by the federal officials who are the only ones that can deport anybody. We're told by those officials that if you don't apprehend at least 15, don't bother to call us. And so we just don't do it as a matter. People are shocked at that. I would have town meetings and I would ask people, what happens if your local police officer, local sheriff apprehends somebody and they think they turn them over to the federal government for deportation? Not happened. Hasn't happened in a long time. But it's gotten worse than that. The argument was, well, what we would do is we would enforce workplace. And we would enforce people, keep them from getting a job. And if they didn't have a job, they wouldn't come to America. And we're going to enforce that. And that's never been effectively enforced either. That's just talk. It's not happening. At a time of extraordinarily high unemployment, at a time when wages for working Americans are sliding downward, not going up. Every month that goes by, we're seeing large numbers of people hired part-time rather than full-time. And all of this is happening while we're totally unwilling to take any action that would stop illegal workers from getting jobs that Americans need to be taking. I mean, we just do. We've got American people that are hurting. We've got American people unemployed. We've got children and grandchildren and grandparents and mothers and daddies unemployed, all only in part-time jobs. And over the last 5 or 6 years, the number of people who have gotten jobs in America is about 1.9 million over that period. That's how many immigrant workers entered the country. So the net improvement in immigration, in a mathematical sense, has all gone to foreign workers who come to America, legally or illegally. And so I guess I'm saying we need to be serious about this. We need to ask ourselves, don't we have an obligation to the American people to faithfully enforce the laws and to end the lawlessness and create a good immigration system that serves the interest of America and American workers? I think we do. I think that's what the American people want. I think they're entitled to that. And I want to show tonight how far away from that we are today. And the reason I'm talking about it is we're about to confirm Jeh Johnson as the Secretary of Homeland Security. And he's a political confidant of the President. And the President has no intention of enforcing the laws. And he's created a circumstance that's not good for this country. And Mr. Johnson, in my brief conversation with him, seemed like a nice enough gentleman, but I just asked him, why do you want this job, Mr. Johnson? You say you believe in law and you believe the laws ought to be enforced. If you take this job, you're not going to be allowed to enforce the laws. You just need to know that. I asked him, was he going to be willing to confront the President and tell him, Mr. President, you can't do this. I'm a sworn officer here. I got thousands of law officers working for me out there on the streets, out there dealing directly with people in violation of American law. And I can't keep telling them not to do what they're required to do. I don't have the ability to deny them the right to enforce the laws of the United States. And as I indicated earlier, that this issue was defined early in the Obama administration. President Bush was slow, but President Bush, after failed immigration reform, comprehensive reform in 2006 and 2007, seemed to get it finally. Very slow, and so he called out the National Guard, which made a positive difference. He stepped up enforcement. We finally began to build some fencing, and he began to have some workplace enforcement. Pretty good bit. They raided some chicken plants in Georgia, and they did that. The other and found hundreds and hundreds of people illegally here working. What happened in Georgia was they had to raise pay to get non-illegals to come to work. What's wrong with that? Pay is too low in America. We need higher wages. Mr. President, I see the Majority Leader. I'd be glad to yield to him. Thank you. That was the thing. So what happened when he took office? Well, the people during the campaign that had been interfacing with the Obama administration obviously had a deal. They were told they were going to stop these kind of enforcements, and they weren't going to do them anymore, and they complained. And it was a completely justified enforcement action in Washington State. So they complained, and as a result, the Secretary of Homeland Security, who Mr. Johnson will replace, Secretary Napolitano, vowed that she would get to the bottom of this problem, close quote. An article in the Washington Times quoted a Homeland Security official as saying the Secretary is, quote, not happy about it. And instead of enforcing the law, the Secretary conducted an investigation. And she investigated the law officers who were simply doing their duty, apparently in response to some demands of advocacy groups that had been pushing them during the campaign. Then Esther Oliveria, Deputy Assistant Secretary of Homeland Security, said on a phone call with employers and pro-amnesty groups that, quote, we're not doing raids or audits under this administration, close quote. We're not doing raids or audits. So this decision, this statement, symbolized the end of workplace enforcement in America. And it's in violation of law because workers are not entitled to work illegally in an American factory or plant. Where did this come from? How did it ever get to be the idea that that Americans have their jobs taken from people illegally in the country? And you can't ever do an investigation or enforcement action and remove people who are illegally here and not authorized to work. Okay. Then in 2010, the administration began implementing its plan to dismantle the immigration law enforcement system as we know it, really. Here's what happened. On May 19, 2010, in an interview with the Chicago Tribune, then Director of ICE, John Martin, announced that ICE may not even process or accept illegal aliens transferred to the agency's custody by Arizona officials. Arizona, of course, is facing a very, very serious crisis.
Will the Senator yield?
I'd be pleased to yield. Another leader has many, many challenges, and be pleased to allow him to take the floor.
Mr. President, my friend,
the Majority Leader.
My friend, junior senator from Alabama, is always so courteous, and I appreciate it very much. I ask that his statement not appear interrupted in the record.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to consideration S.Res. 322.
Clerk will report.
Senate Resolution 322 to authorize the printing of a collection of the rules of the committees of the Senate.
Is there objection to proceeding to the measure? Without objection, so ordered.
I ask unanimous consent the resolution be agreed to, the motion to reconsider be laid on the table, and there be no intervening action or debate.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent the appointment at the desk appears separately in the record as of made by the chair.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent that when the Senate completes its business day, it adjourn until tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. That is December 17th. The following the prayer and the pledge of morning are deemed expired. Journal proceedings be approved to date. The time for 2 leaders be reserved for use later in the day.
Without objection.
So, Mr. President, the first vote will be at 10 a.m. tomorrow morning on the motion to invoke cloture on the motion to concur with respect to the budget agreement. If there's no further business come before the Senate, I ask that it adjourn under the briefs order following the remarks of the Senator from Alabama, Senator Sessions.
Without objection.
Mr. President,
The Senator from Alabama.
I thank Senator Reid. He's always courteous and always treated me fairly. Except we don't always get amendments. We prefer. To continue, Mr. President, on May 27th in 2010, an internal ICE email revealed that top officials declared that the low-risk immigration detainees would be able to have far greater visitation rights, with visitors staying an unlimited amount of time during a 12-hour window, which can really make maintaining order in a detention facility difficult. And also that the detainees would be given access to unmonitored phone lines. The mayor of your town, who's in jail over tax evasion, he doesn't get unmonitored phone line use, but apparently illegal aliens, non-citizens, do. They get email, free internet calling, movie nights, bingo, arts and crafts, dance and cooking classes, tutoring and computer training. All of these are for people who've been apprehended illegally in the country and really should be on a fast turnaround to be returned to the country from which they came. On June 25th of 2010, the National ICE Council, that's the union that represents more than 7,000 fine ICE officers, cast a unanimous vote. They voted no confidence in the their director, John Morton. According to the union, the vote reflected, quote, the growing dissatisfaction among ICE employees and union leaders that Director Morton had abandoned the agency's core mission of enforcing United States immigration laws and enforcing public safety, and has instead directed their attention to campaigning for programs and policies relating to amnesty, close quote. That's a big thing. I've been here in the Senate now for going on 17 years, and I'm not aware of a major governmental employee union voting no confidence in its boss, particularly when it deals with the simple policies of law and enforcement, not even relating to some workplace rule or complaint. So in August of 2010, top ICE officials began circulating a draft policy that would significantly limit the circumstances under which ICE could detain illegal aliens, limiting the circumstances. In effect, ICE agents were no longer authorized to pick up an illegal alien for illegally entering the country. An ICE officer not able to pick up someone for illegally entering the country or for possessing false identification documents, fraudulent documents. Well, you go to the bank or you go to get on an airplane, you use a false document, somebody's going to prosecute you. But if you're apparently a non-citizen who entered the country illegally, you're just given immunity by the administration policy from using false documents. Why? Because they don't want to see the law enforced. That's the reason. They basically have made that decision. So now illegal aliens could only be detained if other law enforcement agency made an arrest for a specific criminal violation unrelated to immigration. So this was the beginning of what would become known as administrative amnesty. Then in December of 2010, the Washington Post article on internal ICE emails and communications reported that ICE had padded its deportation statistics. Many of you have heard that ICE claims to and the administration claims that they've deported far more people than before. Therefore, they should be applauded for being effective law enforcement officers. But it appears, not appears, it's a fact. Those numbers were padded and exaggerated. According to the Washington Post article, ICE included 19,422 removals in fiscal year 2010. There were actually removals from 2009. Now, we've had a problem in this country, and there's a growing concern about this administration not telling the truth. And their philosophy seems to be, we say whatever's convenient at the time, and when we get caught about it, we just don't worry about it. We just keep right on going, and our friendly press or something will just ignore it. But it's beginning to bite now. People are getting tired of this. This was a deliberate 19,000 misrepresentation of the number of removals. The article also described how ICE extended a Mexican repatriation program beyond its operation date, adding 6,500 to the final removal numbers, again, making them look better than they were. In a March 2, 2011 memo, ICE Director Morton outlined new enforcement priorities and encouraged agents not to enforce the law against most illegal aliens and to only take action against those who meet certain priorities. On July 17, 2011, ICE Director Morton issued a second memorandum, further directing ICE agents to refrain from enforcing the law against certain segments of the illegal alien population, criteria similar to that under the DREAM Act. Despite having no legal or congressional authority to do so, and despite the fact that Congress had explicitly rejected the DREAM Act 3 times. And this is a matter of serious constitutional import, as I will discuss later, as cited by prominent legal scholars. On June 17th of 2011, ICE Director Morton issued a third memo instructing ICE personnel to consider refraining from enforcing the law against individuals engaged in a protected activity related to civil or other rights. So if you're in the country illegally, for example, union organizing or complaining to authorities about employment discrimination or housing condition, you can be protected from being deported. Anybody who's in a non-frivolous dispute with an employer, landlord, or contractor seems to be eligible to avoid the consequences of being in the country illegally. On June 23, 2011, the ICE Agents and Officers Union again expressed outrage over Director Morton's actions, noting that since the administration was, quote, unable to pass its immigration agenda through legislation, it is now implementing it through agency policy, close quote. That's exactly what they did. Everybody that knows enough about what's going on knows that's what they did. But somehow, like the frog in the ever-warming water, we're oblivious to the consequences to our separation of powers and to our constitutional structure when an executive branch declares a law and directs a law to be enforced and carried out that was never passed and, in fact, rejected in recent years 3 separate times. The action of the ICE Officers Association accused the political appointees of working, quote, hand in hand, close quote, with the open borders lobby. They see this on a daily basis while excluding its officers, the ICE officers, from the policy development process. In effect, ICE officers allege that the political appointees at ICE were advancing the agenda of those here illegally and maneuvering against their own law enforcement officers trying to do their duty to enforce the law and end the illegality in America. That's exactly what they said was happening, and that is exactly what is happening, colleagues. It just is. On June 27th, internal memoranda revealed that ICE officers attempted to publicly distance themselves from the administrative amnesty policies and deny that they ever existed. That's the top political appointees try to distance themselves from these policies and deny they existed. After the Houston Chronicle exposed Department of Homeland Security directive to review and dismiss valid deportation cases in process. On August 1st, 2011, the Justice Department filed a lawsuit in federal court to stop Alabama's law that was designed to assist the federal government in identifying and moving and bringing forth to the federal officials not to deport people who were in the country illegally. On August 18, 2011, Secretary Napolitano announced that DHS was reviewing all pending and incoming deportation cases to stop proceedings against those illegal aliens who were not DHS priorities. On September 28th of 2011, at a round table with amnesty advocates, President Obama, at a round table with advocates, admitted that his deportation statistics were misleading. Quote, the statistics are actually a little deceptive because what we've been doing is apprehending folks at the borders and sending them back. That is counted as a deportation, even though they may have only been held for a day or 48 hours. Now that's pretty interesting. So the president's now meeting with amnesty advocates, and he's admitting to them, but not to the American people. He told the American people they had an enhanced number of deportations, but when he met with the amnesty people to assuage their complaints that too many people were being deported, he said that the numbers weren't correct. You know, we need the President of the United States to look the group in the eye and say, if you come to America illegally, expect to be deported if we apprehend you. I mean, what else should he say? He is a chief law enforcement officer of America. He's charged with ensuring that the laws of the United States are faithfully executed. On October 12th, in testimony before the House Judiciary Committee, Director Morton admits that Cecilia Munoz, a former National Counsel of La Raza Senior Vice President and now Assistant to the President and Director of the White House Domestic Policy Council, assisted in the preparation of the Administrative Amnesty Memorandum. La Raza has been awfully aggressive on these issues, and they have every right to be aggressive, but I've got to tell you, their positions are nowhere near anything that comes close to being an advocate for a lawful system of immigration in America. They want the lawlessness to continue. So on October 18, 2011, ICE refused to take any action after the Santa Clara County, California Board of Supervisors voted to stop using county funds to honor ICE detainers except in limited circumstances. Let me tell you about this. I've been an attorney general and U.S. attorney. A detainer is a very wonderful law enforcement tool that's critical to harmonious relationships between various agencies. So if somebody is arrests somebody and they're serving time for drug dealing or burglary in another jurisdiction that has a charge against them, they place a detainer against them at that jail. And as soon as they finish their term, they are not released. They're repaired over to the agency that has another charge pending against them. So the Santa Clara County Board of Supervisors voted not to allow federal government to place detainers on people in their jail who are here in the country illegally, and voted, in effect, not to turn them over, as all law enforcement officers do and have done for decades and maybe 100 years or more. So on October 19th, so ICE didn't do anything about it. They still send them federal money for law enforcement. They have things that they could do. They just went along with it because I guess they don't care. On October 19th, ICE refused to act after the District of Columbia, D.C., Mayor Vincent Gray issued an order to prevent the D.C. police from enforcing U.S. immigration law. Among other things, the order prohibits all public safety agencies from inquiring about an individual's immigration status. They can't even inquire about it. Or from contacting ICE if there is no nexus to a direct criminal investigation other than immigration. On October 31st of 2011, well, you know, the District of Columbia knows better than that. I can't imagine this. As much money as the taxpayers all over America pump into this city, and the guys say they won't even, their officers can't even inquire to see if somebody is illegally in the country. That's really a stretch. That's really unacceptable. And we ought to cut off funds for cities that refuse to at least conduct minimal cooperation with federal law enforcement. October 31st, the Justice Department filed a suit against South Carolina to block their immigration law designed to help the federal government enforce immigration laws. They got plenty of time to sue states and other entities who want to help them enforce the laws. They got plenty of time also to meet with amnesty groups, but no time whatsoever to meet with these law officers and find out what their concerns are or to draft policies that would help us be more effective. On November 7th, 2011, USCIS issued a memo. That's a Citizenship and Immigration Service. They're the ones who deal with the applicants of people who want to come here lawfully under certain limited circumstances, and they have to prove certain things before they're admitted. So the USCIS officials, political appointees, issued a memo stating that USCIS will no longer issue, quote, notices to appear in immigration court to illegal aliens who do not meet administration priorities. A major step backward. On November 22nd, the Justice Department filed suit against Utah's immigration enforcement system. Got plenty of time to sue Utah, who would like to help them enforce the law. On November 22nd, ICE refused to act after Mayor Michael Bloomberg signed a measure ordering all New York City jails to ignore certain ICE detainers issued to deport illegal aliens from those jails. So the mayor of New York issues an order not to honor the detainers placed there by federal government, United States government. And Mr. Bloomberg is spending millions of dollars of his hundreds of thousands, I think millions, of his billion-dollar wealth to lobby the House to pass an amnesty bill. It's his money. I guess he can spend it where he wants to. But just because he's made $1 billion, I don't think it suggests to me that he has any better idea about how to run the immigration system of the United States than I do, who spent 14 years dealing with federal law enforcement. On December 15, 2011, DHS rescinded the Maricopa County, Arizona's 287G agreement, a cooperative agreement whereby local law enforcement received training in identifying and apprehending illegal aliens and handling them in a way perfectly consistent with law and beyond law, being very careful in how we treat people who are detained in a decent and very fine way. The 287G program is a very fine program. It really is good, and it's a great disappointment to me that this administration has basically killed it. I remember Alabama was the first state in the nation that participated in 287G. A certain number of officers, not a huge number, came to our training center for several weeks and were trained on how to be a valuable assistance to the federal officers to maximize their ability to be effective. This has been canceled. It's basically ended under this administration. Director Morton told the Maricopa County attorney that ICE will no longer respond to calls from the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office involving traffic stops, civil infractions, or other minor offenses. DHS's legal reasoning is unclear, given that federal law requires the federal government to respond to inquiries by law enforcement agencies to verify immigration status. In other words, local officers, they apprehend somebody, they make an inquiry as to whether this person is lawfully in the country, and they have a right to be responded to. Apparently, they've chosen not to respond to that basic law enforcement request. December 29, 2011, ICE announced the creation of a 24-hour hotline for illegal alien detainees to be staffed by the Law Enforcement Support Center, the same organization that ICE had already stated was understaffed to keep up with the immigration status check request from state and local law enforcement. They were getting lots of requests from statuses on people and whether or not they were illegally here from local law enforcement. They don't have enough time to do that. Now these officers have been given the extra duty of having a 24-hour hotline for illegal alien detainees. Who are we serving here? ICE then revised its detainer form to include a new provision that says ICE should consider this request for a detainer operative only upon the subject's conviction, close quote, of an offense. It just completely ignores the fact that presence in the United States of America illegally is a criminal offense. Entry into the United States illegal is certainly a criminal offense. On January 3rd of 2012, a report by the Inspector General revealed that USCIS officials, top political officials, pressured the employees to approve applications that should have been denied, and that employees believe they did not have enough time to complete the interviews of applicants, quote, leaving ample opportunity for critical information to be overlooked. The 9/11 Commission said people should be interviewed face-to-face, and this is being collapsed today totally. On January 10, 2012, the President promoted Cecilia Munoz to be the new director of his Domestic Policy Council. She previously served as Senior Vice President of La Raza and took very extreme views, frankly. She should not be the person. We need an objective person in that position, not an advocate for really undermining a law. Goodness. On January 7th, I'm not saying that this is a bad person. She's perfectly legitimate to be an advocate for amnesty or open borders. It's a free country, but they ought not to be put in a top position where the duty is to enforce the law. On January 17th of 2012, DHS stopped the rollout of the Secure Communities Act in Alabama, according to a DHS email, because the administration disagrees with Alabama's immigration law. They just quit cooperating on a basic event. On January of 2012, ICE attorneys in Denver and Baltimore recommended the agency voluntarily close 1,600 removal cases, resulting in the release of illegal aliens already in proceedings without consequence. of their violation of immigration laws. On January 19, 2012, the President issued an executive order from the President waiving certain screening safeguards, allowing those applying for non-immigrant visas, people to come here to work only, to obtain them more easily from China and Brazil. And on the same day, the State Department announced it will waive the long-standing statutory requirement of in-person interviews by a consular official in Brazil or China or Yemen or wherever. On February 7, 2012, ICE announced the creation of the public advocate, who is to serve as a point of contact for aliens in removal proceedings, community and advocacy groups, and others who have concerns, questions, and recommendations they would like to raise about the enforcement of laws and amnesty efforts. 2012, the President revealed in his budget a proposal to cut funding for ICE and the 287G program, effectively gutting that. On April 17th of 2012, the administration announced it would reduce National Guard troops stationed at the border from 1,200 to 300. Just one more action. Is this an action of an administration that seems to be interested in seeing that we have a lawful system of immigration that we can be proud of, a legal system that promotes the interest of the United States of America? Are we at a point in time where we're undermining law? Well, I got about half of these done so far, and I could continue. It goes on and on and on and on. And it's a consistent trend and agenda. And it's basically, if you don't grant amnesty, Congress, I'm not going to enforce the law. Just forget it. I'm going to direct my officers to do what I want them to do, not what the law of the United States requires them to do. It's a deep and fundamental challenge to the very integrity of the American constitutional order. You say, Jeff, you're exaggerating. Well, let me just tell you about a recent House Judiciary hearing that was held on the President's constitutional duty to faithfully execute the laws. Chairman Goodlatte summarized the reason for the hearing as follows, quote, "The Obama administration has ignored the Constitution's carefully balanced separation of powers and unilaterally granted itself the extra constitutional authority to amend the laws and to waive or suspend their enforcement. This raw assertion of authority goes well beyond the executive power granted to the President and specifically violates the Constitution's command that the President is to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. The President's encroachment into Congress's sphere of power is not a transgression that should be taken lightly." As English historian Edward Gibbon, Decline and Fall author, observed in his Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire book, noted that the principles of a free constitution are irrevocably lost when the legislative power is dominated by the executive. So from Obamacare to immigration, the current administration is picking and choosing which laws to enforce. So this is correct. I believe Chairman Goodlatte is discussing an important issue. And what about the testimony of the witnesses at that hearing? It was really stunning. One witness, Professor Jonathan Turley, well known throughout the country, writes a lot in publications and legal journals. who is the Shapiro Professor of Public Interest Law at George Washington University Law School and nationally recognized constitutional scholar, said he is a supporter of President Obama's policies and voted for him. But I want you to hear this, colleagues. Professor Turley at the hearing said this, quote, "I believe the President has exceeded his brief. The President is required to faithfully execute the laws. He is not required to enforce all laws equally or commit the same resources to them, but I believe the President has crossed the constitutional line in some of these areas." He goes on, this is a direct quote, quote, "This goes to the very heart of what is the Madisonian system. If a president can unilaterally change the meaning of laws in a substantial way and refuse to enforce them, it takes offline that very thing that stabilizes our system." He goes on, quote, "I believe the members will loathe the day they allow that to happen." He's talking about members of Congress. Quote, "I believe the members of Congress will loathe the day they allow that to happen." He goes on, quote, "This will not be our last president. There will be more presidents who will claim the same authority." Quote, "When I teach constitutional law, I often ask my students, what is the limiting principle of your argument? When that question is presented to this White House, too often it's answered in the first person, that the President is the limiting principle, or at least the limiting person. We can't rely on that type of assurance in our system," close quote. That's what Professor Turley said, who voted for President Obama, and a well-known legal scholar. That is dramatic testimony. And we need to listen to it. And I'm hearing it from my constituents daily. They think this administration is not telling the truth on a regular basis. They can't imagine how we can pass a health care law and the President just go in and pick and choose which parts of it he wants to go forward, what parts he wants to delay. How can this happen? Is this a legal system or not? Mr. Turley goes on, quote, "The problem of what the President is doing is that he is not simply posing a danger to the constitutional system, he is becoming the very danger the Constitution was designed to avoid. That is the concentration of power in any single branch. This Newtonian orbit that the three branches exist in is a delicate one, but it is designed to prevent this type of concentration," close quote. Wow. This is very strong. Then when Professor Turley was asked whether the President had acted contrary to the Constitution, Professor Turley answered in the affirmative. He said further, quote, "I really have great trepidation over where we are heading because we are creating a new system here. Something that is not what was designed. We have this rising fourth branch in a system that's tripartite. The center of gravity is shifting, and that makes it unstable. And within that system, you have the rise of an uber presidency. There could be no greater danger for individual liberty. And I really think that the framers would be horrified by that shift because everything they've dedicated themselves to was creating this orbital balance, and we've lost it," close quote. That makes the hair stand on the back of my neck. This goes to the core of our government. Are we a legal system or not? And if we start eroding these classical principles of law, duty, and responsibility, the appropriate balance between the three branches of government, we've done something that's important. As Professor Turley said, we're undermining the orbital balance, and indeed he says we've lost it. Professor Turley, not me, Professor Turley goes on to say, quote, "It's not prosecutorial discretion to go into a law and say an entire category of people will no longer be subject to the law. That's legislative decision." Close quote. It's a legislative decision, not the president's decision. The legislature represents the people. Over a period of years, people are elected to this body in the House. Prosecutorial goes on, quote, "Prosecutorial discretion," Professor Turley says, "is a case-by-case decision that is made by the Department of Justice. When the Department of Justice starts to say, we're going to extend that to whole sections of law, then they are engaging in a legislative act, not an act of prosecutorial discretion. Wherever the line is drawn, it's got to be drawn somewhere from here. It can't include categorical rejections of the application of law to millions of people." Close quote. Great Scott! He is so correct. Prosecutors have discretion. They don't have to prosecute every case that comes before them and factors in and into that. But the president doesn't have power just to eviscerate whole sections of law that affect millions of people. Professor Turley hit that exactly correct. He goes on to say, quote, "Many of these questions are not close, in my view. The president is outside the line. And that's where we have the most serious constitutional crisis, I view, in my lifetime. And that is, this body is becoming less and less relevant," close quote. He's talking to the House of Representatives. "You're becoming less and less relevant." And he considers this to be the most serious constitutional crisis in my lifetime. And we've sit here oblivious to what's been happening. I've talked about it an awful lot, but I guess I've not been very effective. And really it's and Professor Turley's arguments and remarks just hammer home how serious it is, this question we're dealing with. So he goes on to say this, quote, "I believe that Congress is facing a critical crossroads in terms of its continued relevancy in this process. What this body cannot become is a debating society where it can issue rules and laws that are either complied with or not complied with by the president. I think that's where we are. A president cannot ignore an express statement on policy grounds." Close quote. He's saying the president cannot ignore an express statement of law because he has a different policy view. Now, does anybody contend that he does? I'd like to see him send me a note on it. Any member of this body that thinks the President of the United States can ignore an express statement of law because he disagrees with it on policy grounds, I'd like to hear him defend that issue or explain their position on it. He goes on to say, "In terms of the institutional issue, look around you. Is this truly the body that existed when it was formed?" He's talking to the House now. "Does it have the same gravitational pull and authority that was given to it by the framers? You're the keepers of this authority. You took an oath to uphold it, and the framers assumed that you would have the institutional wherewithal and, frankly, ambition to defend the turf that is the legislative branch." Close quote. Isn't that true? The framers assumed that you would have the institutional wherewithal and, frankly, ambition to defend the turf that is the legislative branch. We're sitting here and we've had the majority leader stand up right before the presiding officer and break the rules of the Senate to amend the Senate rules. Just a few weeks ago. Just a stunning development. This is third world stuff. This is not the United States of America, a constitutional republic that I served as a prosecutor year after year. We took so much pride, my staff and I, in trying to make sure that nobody was given an advantage or disadvantage based on status or wealth or race or intelligence or background or whatever advantage they had. Equal justice under the law. And we enforced the law whether anybody would have voted for it or not had we been in Congress. It was passed by Congress. We enforced the law. At that same hearing, Nicholas Rosencrantz, a professor of law at Georgetown University Law Center and author of the single most downloaded article about constitutional interpretation in the history of the Social Science Network, also testified before the House Judiciary Committee. He stated that the President's constitutional duty to take care that the laws be faithfully executed, quote, is not optional. It is mandatory, close quote, and that President Obama's, quote, wholesale suspension of law is a paradigm case of a take-care clause violation, close quote. He further testified, quote, what's striking about this is the President's decision to enforce the immigration laws as though the DREAM Act had been enacted, when in fact it has not. Rather than declining to comply with the law with a duly enacted statute, the President is complying meticulously, but with a bill that never became law. So they offered a bill. It was rejected by the Congress, and the President is almost to the letter enforcing it, a bill rejected by the people's representatives. Professor Rosencrantz goes on to say, quote, Congress has repeatedly considered the DREAM Act. The President favors this act. Congress has repeatedly declined to pass it. So the President simply announced that he would enforce the Immigration and Nationality Act as though it had been, as though the DREAM Act had been enacted. To put the point another way, the President's duty is to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. Laws with a capital L, not those bills that fail to become law, like the DREAM Act, close quote. I think this is a serious matter, and I think the professor hits it directly. Professor Rosencrantz was in agreement with Professor Turley that, quote, prosecutorial discretion is one thing, it's real, but wholesale suspension of law is quite something else, and that is what has happened under Obamacare. Likewise, in the immigration context, kind of case-by-case prosecutorial discretion is one thing, but a blanket policy that the Immigration Act will not apply to 1.8 million people, that's quite something different. This is a scale of decision-making that is not within the traditional conception of prosecutorial discretion, close quote. Well, that is certainly true. It just really is. It's hard to believe we're here. I think we're here because in the great law schools of America and the top levels of our academic world, in our news media and so forth, we're moved in sort of a postmodern world in which words don't have meaning. They're subject to being altered whenever they choose to fit the mood of the moment. The President said when he nominated people for the Supreme Court, he wanted nominees who would show empathy. Well, what is empathy? It's not law. Is it politics? Is it bias? Is it personal opinion? Our system is based on law, not empathy, not bias, not politics, not ideology. This is a serious matter. Chairman Goodlatte then interjected, quote, "In fact, the President has taken it a step further." He wrapped up the meeting and has actually given legal documents to the people in that circumstance, well beyond simply deciding not to leave them there and not prosecute them, but to actually enable their violation of the law by giving them documents to help them evade the problems that ensue from living in a country that they're not lawfully present in. Close quote. Professor Rosencrantz replied, quite right. Now, this matter's not going away. We're going to deal with it. I truly believe the American people expect this government of theirs that works for them to produce an immigration system, a legal system that involves Obamacare and other policies that is committed to law and not to the feelings of the chief executive and not to his policy preferences. If we avoid that, then we've got a serious, serious matter in this country that goes to the heart of the strength of this republic. You could sap that strength, erode the power of our legal system, and the legal system, in my opinion, is the greatest strength this nation has. I thank the chair and would yield the floor. And we yield the floor.
Under the previous order, the Senate stands adjourned until 9 a.m. tomorrow.
So the Senate's gavelled out, but earlier today, members confirmed Ann Patterson